WashingTECH.
And when we think about accountability and we think about how these platforms are harming marginalized groups, we need to think about them in the US, of course, but also think about marginalized groups around the world and really broaden our lens even further.
Are you worried about your kids' safety on the internet? We are here to help. WashingTECH's 5-step checklist will take you through the process of protecting your kids, and will give you tips on how to set up the best parental controls for your children on their devices. You want what's best for your children. They deserve to be safe online. Our step-by-step guide will help you make sure they are. Download WashingTECH's online safety checklist today to protect your kids online. Find it at protectyourkids.online. That's protectyourkids.online.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Spandana Singh, who is with New America's Open Technology Institute, where she leads a portfolio of work focused on content moderation, disinformation, algorithmic accountability, and transparency. Spandi is also currently a non-resident fellow at the Esya Centre in Delhi and a member of the World Economic Forum's expert network. Spandi Singh. Spandi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us about your background and what brought you to the world of tech policy at New America.
Sure. So I initially started my career working in the international development space in Southeast Asia. And I was really interested in exploring opportunities for harnessing technology to enact social change. But as I started working on projects in that area, I became increasingly interested in more policy-oriented topics like privacy, security, and transparency. And that interest led me to joining Twitter's public policy team in San Francisco, where I worked on some stakeholder engagement work, as well as content moderation, transparency, and corporate philanthropy projects. And after my time at Twitter, I knew that I wanted to continue working in the tech policy space, but I really wanted to go somewhere where I could learn about a range of tech policy issues, but with an equity lens. And I think New America and OTI has been a really great place for that. It's allowed me to work on a really broad range of projects, both domestic and international, and sort of build a portfolio around broader platform accountability and AI issues.
So you've been working on this issue for a fair amount of time now. You and Marguerite Blaise wrote a report in 2020 looking at what platforms were doing then to counter misinformation and disinformation. How have things generally been progressing with those efforts in your view? What are some examples?
So I think 2020 was a really interesting period for online misinformation and disinformation because although we have been talking about misleading information in the online ecosystem since 2016, platforms had generally adopted a pretty relaxed fashion and approach. But in 2020, when COVID started, platforms came under a lot of pressure to tackle COVID misinformation and disinformation because I think we saw really stark examples of how online misleading information can result in offline harm. So platforms really expanded their sort of approaches to tackling this kind of content. And then they also faced pressure to carry these efforts over into the 2020 election. So it was really interesting and almost exciting to see platforms take a more robust approach to election misinformation and disinformation during this time. But between 2020 and now, it's been disheartening to see that there have only been a limited number of additional improvements on this front. So, for example, platforms have invested a lot in building partnerships, which allow them to identify and lift up authoritative information around elections, which is really important for ensuring everybody has access to accurate information around voting, like when the polls are open, when voting dates are, how to register, and so on. Platforms now, most of them also have clear policies that prohibit election misinformation and disinformation in organic content. And they also generally allow users to sort of flag this content for review if they see it on these services. So these are important improvements, but honestly, these are foundational level things that platforms should already be doing when we're talking about such a consequential area of life and we're talking about content that can suppress voting, that can impact so many different kinds of marginalized communities. And while there have been some improvements in these areas, I'm also pretty skeptical that platforms are engaging in enough stakeholder consultation to ensure that, as the nature of voter suppression online and election misinformation and disinformation online changes, that their policies are, staying up to date. And I'm also really concerned that platforms aren't investing more in enforcing these policies adequately, both in English, but also in non-English languages like Spanish, Mandarin, Hindi, and so on.
Yes, I'm an old man now, but several years ago, the media companies would push back when folks said there was a connection between hate speech and actual harms. And Jessica Gonzalez at Free Press was among the first to raise that issue. And now, lo and behold, that's exactly what's happening. And we no longer see it. We no longer need to undertake these massive, expensive studies to find that connection. All the information is already there thanks to social media and the scale at which hate speech can incite violence, such as the violence we saw during the Capitol Hill insurrection, January 6, 2021. It's disquieting, really, to say the least. I haven't seen much improvement, and now we're seeing it in advertising as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. They're definitely not doing great. I think only a handful of internet platforms right now have clear policies that prevent election misinformation and disinformation in their ads. Again, that's like a really baseline thing that they should be doing, and they're not doing it. Even fewer platforms have comprehensive review processes for their ads. And these processes are really important for ensuring that someone is looking at these ads and making sure that they don't contain harmful or misleading content. And then platforms also, one thing I've really pushed many of them to do is to disclose data around what kind of ads are circulating on their services in error, i.e., where are your review processes falling short and how can we help you improve them? And right now, Reddit is the only platform that offers that kind of data, albeit in like a very limited fashion. So I definitely think that, while platforms have invested more in lifting up authoritative information and, doing some more bare minimum things in the content moderation space, they have not made really important changes over the last 2 years, especially in the ad space. And I would also add that, a lot of research shows that sometimes it's like a small number of people or organizations are the ones who are spreading the largest amount of misleading information, and they're often called super spreaders. And despite the fact that this is like, stuff that has been researched a lot, many platforms don't have clear policies that prevent super spreaders from repeatedly circulating misleading information on their platform. And this allows these super spreaders to monetize spreading such inflammatory content on their services. And it really creates a system of incentives where, they're not being penalized and they're making a lot of money off of the advertising on these contents. And so they continue doing so.
Yeah, Reddit is nuts, though.
It is.
You never know what you're going to see on there.
Policy is global policy. This is the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, serving the world.
How transparent have social media companies been about how they're dealing with these issues?
Not very transparent at all. And this is one of my biggest concerns. I think, I am not a proponent for transparency for the sake of transparency. I think that there are some really key things that platforms need to be transparent around their efforts to combat election misinformation, disinformation, for the sole reason that if they're not sharing data around how effective their mechanisms to combat this information has been over the last few years, we don't know what's worked well and what hasn't worked well. And if we don't know that, which is again a very baseline sort of level of insight, then we don't know what they should be doing to prepare for the midterms. We don't know how they should be changing to prepare for 2024. We don't know how they should be changing to tackle elections in different parts of the world, right? And so the fact that we have literally like very little data at this point is really concerning. And, some companies have shared minimal sort of insights around, we redesigned our labels, or we introduced this feature and we saw like this percent kind of impact. But I'm talking about like constant, every quarter, what are the changes that this feature has had on the nature of election misinformation and disinformation on your cycle. I want granular data. And I want there to be a lot more thinking around what meaningful data is in this space and what that can help us do. And I also would add that I think, sometimes maybe this data doesn't need to be public. Maybe you can think about specific researchers who can access this data. So there are different ways of sharing this data in different audiences. But right now we've got nothing. So
you and Quinn NX Rise developed a scorecard that's based on that report you did back in 2020 that sought to monitor how companies monitor these issues in an ongoing way. Tell us about that.
Sure. So the scorecard built on our 2020 report. And essentially what we did was we chose a subset of the recommendations from the 2020 report, which we thought were like the baseline things that platforms should be doing in this area. And we evaluated how 10 platforms were meeting these recommendations, basically to demonstrate where platforms had been investing resources, over the last 2 years and where they'd made no progress. And the scores were assigned, on publicly available and accessible information. And I think that, while we don't plan to update the scorecard continuously right now, I think it really helped to shine a light on the fact that platforms have not made significant progress in areas that civil society, civil rights groups, researchers have underscored are really critical to protecting our democracy and the electoral process, and especially advertising, I would say, is a huge area. I think it also kind of suggested to me that platforms view election issues on their services as cyclical rather than issues that they should be tackling year round. Just because an election happens and like the polls close doesn't mean that people stop spreading misleading information about the outcome of an election or about a candidate, right? So this is a daily effort, but I don't think platforms see it that way. And I think that's a huge problem.
It's interesting you say that for all of these tech companies' obsession with agile teams and people needing to be in the office every single day for stand-up meetings. We don't tend to hear a lot about the operationalization of ethical standards, but this has been a helpful conversation. So thanks for that, Spandi. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Definitely. I think also important when we talk about sort of platform issues to sometimes zoom out a little bit. And I want to just leave some food for thought, which is that, if these internet platforms are falling woefully short in the fight against election misinformation and disinformation in the US, which is, one of the markets where they face the largest pressure and threat of regulation from policymakers, and they engage in a lot of advocacy with civil society, I am even more concerned about how they're tackling or fail to tackling this kind of information in other countries. I think large tech companies often neglect countries in the global south, especially when it comes to creating and enforcing responsible policies and practices. And I think that when we think about accountability and we think about how these platforms are harming marginalized groups, we need to think about them in the US, of course, but also think about marginalized groups around the world and really broaden our lens even further. And for finding me online, you can find me at Twitter. My handle is @Spandi_S.
Great international perspective. It's refreshing to hear. Spandi Singh, policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute. Spandi, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
WashingTECH.